Cut to the hospital scene, where our protagonist rushes to check on his mother and is relieved to find her safe and sound. As he watches the television in the hospital room, a news report comes on featuring an interview with him. Despite feeling overwhelmed by the questions, he explains that his motivation for participating in the dungeon raid was to protect his loved ones. Feeling embarrassed, the protagonist turns off the TV and is surprised to receive a notification informing him that his divine power has increased. He decides to browse job advertisements and comes across one for security management, which he finds intriguing. However, he decides to go home first before making any decisions. As he contemplates the job offer, he receives another notification informing him that several gods are also applying for the same job. This comes as a shock to him, but he quickly decides to apply and is transported to an unknown location. The protagonist soon came to the realization that he had arrived and have faced his forges, but he was not pleased with how scorching it was. Out of nowhere, a mysterious figure emerged behind him and introduced himself as Hephaestus. Startled, the protagonist introduced himself and wondered if Hephaestus had overheard his complaints about the heat. The Hephaestus proceeded to praise the protagonist for his bravery in fighting in Thor's dungeon and revealed that he had the audacity to request air conditioning in his smithy. Embarrassed, the protagonist apologized and half-faced. This went on to explain the task at hand, pulling out a horn from a portal and blowing it. The sound summoned a group of dwarfs whom Hephaestus introduced to the protagonist as his new team. While the protagonist exchanged pleasantries with them, Hephaestus whispered to him that the dwarfs were highly skilled, but also incredibly problematic. He revealed that they had stolen a pendant he had planned to gift to Freya, the goddess of beauty, while working a few weeks prior. The Hephaestus then handed the protagonist a weapon and explained that he needed to go to Mount Olympus for a day, urging him to take care of the smithy in his absence. Although the protagonist asked for more details about his mission, Hephaestus assured him that everything would be alright as long as he was stronger than the dwarfs. With that, the face just left, leaving the protagonist with the dwarfs. As he exchanged greetings with the intimidating-looking dwarfs, the protagonist realized why Hephaestus had assigned them to him. Suddenly, they all pointed guns at him, stunning him before rendering him unconscious. Upon regaining consciousness, the protagonist finds himself tied to a pillar in his surprise to see two dwarfs in front of him. Despite feeling annoyed, he tries to intimidate them. The dwarfs, however, laugh at his threat and mock his reliance on Hephaestus for protection. One of the dwarfs then calls for their attention, giving the protagonist an opportunity to cut the rope. When the dwarfs turn their attention back to the protagonist, he threatens them again and they continue to mock him. The protagonist then frees himself with a knife, stunning the dwarfs and strikes them, sending them flying. He ties them up in his, relieved that he has a weapon, recalling the words of a mysterious girl and promising to thank her if they meet again in the future. Suddenly something shiny catches his attention before the scene shifts to one of the dwarfs calling for their boss. As they prepare to leave the dwarf, Captain Red Fist motivates the dwarfs, stating that Hephaestus has humiliated them enough, and they will get revenge. The dwarfs shout in agreement, and the protagonist watches from a hiding spot. Feeling confused, a group of dwarfs spot the protagonist and launch an attack. He takes cover behind a pillar while the dwarfs continue their assault Red Fist. The dwarf captain then approaches the protagonist and speaks to him. He offers the protagonist a choice to either join them in raiding a fastest forge or to leave and forget what he has seen. The protagonist is hesitant and weighs the consequences of each option, but ultimately decides not to let either happen. He realizes that he would rather fight the dwarfs than be killed by Hephaestus, and steps out with his hands up. The protagonist questions the dwarfs, asking why they are doing this, and what they think Hephaestus will do to them if he finds out. One of the dwarfs becomes angry at the protagonist's words and shoots him. The dwarf then attempts to finish the protagonist off, but is stopped by Red Fist, who approaches the protagonist and begins to insult Hephaestus, calling him trash. The protagonist inquired about why Red Fist had referred to Hephaestus trash. Red Fist proceeded to explain that Hephaestus had visited their mountain and was impressed with their skills. He had convinced them to work with him, and they had agreed to work only 5 to 6 hours per week. Initially they were pleased with this arrangement, but they were unaware that their compassionate nature was being taken advantage of. They were essentially becoming slaves to Hephaestus, and if it weren't for this they would have shared in his wealth. Red Fist revealed that this was why they wanted to seek revenge, and the protagonist jokingly agreed that Hephaestus was indeed trash. This statement enraged Red Fist, who ordered his men to attack, but the protagonist managed to stop them and urged them to listen to him. He called them cowards for attempting to flee and challenged them to a duel. One of the dwarfs became irritated and tried to shoot the protagonist, but Red Fist intervened and agreed to the protagonist's challenge. The protagonist was pleased that Red Fist had taken the bait and prepared for the upcoming battle. Red Fist launched an attack, but the protagonist evaded it. Surprised by the protagonist's strength, the protagonist responded by attacking without hesitation. Red Fist managed to dodge and counter with a massive blow, but the protagonist was able to avoid it and strike back successfully. Feeling damage to Red Fist, impressed by the protagonist's strength, attacked with all his might. The protagonist urged him to bring it on, and they engaged in an intense battle with the protagonist delivering devastating strikes in Red Fist. Retaliating suddenly, Red Fist remembered what Smithy was and recalled the day when Hephaestus had first brought them there. He had constantly been reminded of his own inadequacy, causing him to blame someone competent for his own incompetence. As the protagonist was about to deliver the final blow, Hephaestus intervened and questioned what was going on. He acknowledged that he had expected them to fight, but was surprised by the mess they had made. Afterwards, he turned towards Red Fist and gestured for him to clarify why his irons were out. Red Fist confesses to attempting to steal the iron, but before he can explain why, the protagonist interrupts and takes the blame for making him do it. The protagonist shows a pendant is an explanation and Red Fist becomes frightened upon seeing it. However, the protagonist covers for Red Fist by saying they found it in the warehouse. The Hephaestus is surprised and asks Red Fist if it's true, but before he can answer, the fastest is impressed by their care for his smithy and funding his necklace, so he doesn't ask any more questions. He compliments the protagonist and gives Red Fist his hammer while giving him words of encouragement. This brings tears to Red Fist and the other dwarfs. Later, the Hephaestus calls the protagonist to thank them and reward them with a gift. The protagonist receives a box containing, curious to see what it is. He later discovers that it was a cute monster fox which Hephaestus reveals can transform into any weapon in the universe. He jokingly offers it to the other dwarfs, but the protagonist joyfully accepts and names the fox Snow White the fastest, then transfers ownership to the protagonist and leaves. Before leaving, the protagonist is stopped by Red Fist, who questions why they lied to help them. The protagonist explains that he could relate to Red Fist's past and believes in living to help one another. Red Fist thanks the protagonist and hopes to repay the favor someday, despite the dishonor on his tribe's name. He thanks the protagonist again and urges his fellow dwarfs to get back to work. Next we are shown Jaidi, a 37-year-old hunter manager who recently became the general manager of the country's largest hunter department store. Initially feeling good about himself, the scene shifts to him looking furious when he sees the protagonist approaching his store looking like a beggar to sell something. Despite this, Bei welcomes him to the hunter department and takes him to the appraisal center, where an old man inspects the equipment the protagonist brought. The old man asks where he got the equipment, and the protagonist says he got it from a random person he knows. However, the old man then explains that the protagonist's equipment is all of the highest quality 4-star equipment, and that he's the first person to ever want to discard items of this quality. JB is shocked and wonders where the protagonist got the equipment from. He takes the protagonist to the VIP room where they negotiate the price of the items to about 3 billion. The protagonist is shocked by this and wonders why a bunch of Hephaestus failure weapons were worth so much. Bei is determined to get his hands on the highest quality equipment and asks if the protagonist plans to sell them. However, the protagonist reveals that he plans to sell them all but not to Jibe, causing Jibe to lose his position within a week. The scene then cuts to the protagonist, who has already sold the equipment, and is shocked to see so much money in his account. He immediately decides to go see his mom. After arriving at his mom's place with a bundle of gifts, she is shocked. However, their conversation is shortly interrupted by someone who shows her son on TV. Overwhelmed by her son's talent, she begins to cry tears of joy, but the protagonist urges her not to as they watch the news together. The protagonist starts blushing as his mom watches in joy, feeling good about himself. The protagonist applies for a job to exterminate lost spirits in Eden with the reward of a golden apple that he believes could cure his mom's cancer. However, a breaking news report suddenly appears showing the dungeon that has appeared, and Snow, who is frightened, hides in the protagonist's shirt. As a result, the protagonist suddenly has a vision that stuns him. He decides to leave and says goodbye to his mom before the scene cuts to a group of goblins battling hunters. Suddenly, the protagonist appeared, gaining the attention of the hunters below. The leader of a group of soldiers is then informed by his men that there is a civilian in a restricted area. He orders them to apprehend the civilian, but upon seeing the journalists making up speculations, he decides to go there himself. Using his skill wind gallop, he jumps up to where the protagonist is located and urges him to leave the area. However, the protagonist ignores him and continues to smile, which angers and stuns the leader. He tries to attack the protagonist, but he easily dodges and counters the attack. The protagonist makes a scene to gain attention, and a journalist remembers him as Yadama, who cleared the maze dungeon. After gaining enough attention, the protagonist jumps into a gate, stunning everyone, and enters a world restricted to gods. He tries to explore the world, but is blocked by a force field due to his lack of divine power. Frustrated, he enters a cave that he saw earlier. Inside the cave, the protagonist defeats many goblins and searches for the boss of the dungeon. Suddenly, he is attacked by a red creature that turns out to be the dungeon boss. The protagonist easily dodges and breaks the boss's weapons and then defeats it with a strike using snow. The protagonist was worried upon realizing that there was no notification indicating his victory over the dungeon boss. As a result, he made the decision to extract the core of the defeated boss's evidence. After extracting the core of the dungeon boss, he is stunned when the core begins to move. Out of nowhere, a notification pops up declaring that the core of the gate has been acquired, which will result in the gate's permanent disappearance. We are then transported outside the gate, where a group of people eagerly awaits the protagonist's return. Upon stepping out, the protagonist is taken aback by the crowd and bombarded with inquiries about how he entered the gate. Feeling pleased with himself, the protagonist is met with a barrage of questions. However, he persuades them to wait and goes on to explain how humanity can now demolish gates. The protagonist demonstrates this by destroying the extracted dungeon core, which causes the dungeon to disappear permanently. A woman is amazed and asks for the protagonist's identity, to which he replies, "I am you damn Duke." In a flash, news of the protagonist's achievements spreads worldwide, boosting his divine points. Just as he is about to check an important notification, a journalist interrupts him and urges him to deliver a speech. Suddenly, a mysterious woman from the Sanguine Guild appears, stunning everyone. She informs the protagonist that the guild master wishes to see him and encourages him to come along. We appreciate you for sticking with us until the end. If you enjoyed part 2 of this video, please show your support by liking and subscribing. Additionally, let us know in the comments if you would like to see a part 3.